We all have our favorite wargaming systems, and it's natural when a new system comes out to jump in, anything to justify new tactics or purchasing new miniatures, especially if it's a well-known IP or if there's a local community that you can jump in and play, build, paint, and collect. But within that framework, there's always the question of putting resources into a miniature game. You want to make sure it's going to be around. You want to make sure that there is a player base. And that's not to say that you can't grow your own. From that perspective, a framework, it's been a number of years now. But 4-5 years ago, when God Tier, which is a fantasy-based skirmish game by Steam Forged Games, released, I got in at ground zero. Now, I wasn't looking for a new game to jump into, but the miniatures were fantastic, and the gameplay was extremely dynamic. Literally built up the best of a skirmish-type war game for the here and now of today. And I've explored a lot of different war bands and tactics and pushed that up under the God Tier playlist here on the channel. But I say within that framework in that literally I picked up the starter sets and the few starting war bands, and that was it. There was nobody else in the area here playing. And I took the time to build up a club, a gaming group, where we have a regularly, monthly, twice a month God Tier group that plays and meets. So it is possible if you jump into a system that is not established in your area to kind of build that up. But within that framework, and this gets to the question of the day as a wargaming enthusiast, are there just some systems that you should avoid? Now, the question from that, what do we mean by avoid? Let's talk about X-Wing miniatures as the perfect example, because one could make the point, don't ever get involved in a miniature-based game where the company producing it does not own the IP, does not own the physical property, the licensing behind it. Two examples that are correct, love or hate them, Games Workshop, Warhammer 40,000. The rules and the IP go hand in hand. They are owned by Games Workshop. Likewise, God Tier, Steam Forged Games, they own that IP. Anytime you get a system, now we jump to X-Wing miniatures, where Fantasy Flight put out a 1-2 knockout punch, in my opinion. The rules were dynamic. They played well enough. You had a lot of different mix and match with the cards. The ships were pre-painted. They looked fantastic. Literally, you pop them out of the pack and you're ready to play. But that was on borrowed time. It's Star Wars. Everybody knows Star Wars. Finding players was probably the easiest thing ever. I knew when X-Wing miniatures released, what got me into X-Wing miniatures initially was, and let's just be honest, I enjoy Star Wars. I like Star Wars. Could I hold my own in a lore contest? Probably not, but I grew up with Star Wars. It's part of the culture. But I knew that this system, X-Wing Miniatures, was based on the flight path system of Wings of Glory, World War I, World War II, another fantastic miniatures game. So I knew the mechanics were solid. But I also knew, and I wasn't looking to jump into a war game at the time, I also knew that everybody knows Star Wars. If you have pre-painted ships, I'm going to be able to show up anytime, any place at the gaming club at the store and be able to get a game in. I don't have to schedule anything in advance. And literally, we were there, myself and a few others were there on launch day with the starter set and I think like wave 1. Within a month, there was like 40 players. It was just crazy. So this idea of Star Wars by Fantasy Flight Games, X-Wing Miniatures, it had everything for an auto win, but it was on borrowed time because Fantasy Flight doesn't own the IP. So once all the money was extracted or once the licensing was up, I guess it's kind of like rent. Fantasy Flight is renting that IP for whatever crazy amount up front and of sales, percentage of sales, whatever that negotiation is going to be. Once that is up, I don't know 5 years, 10 years, once that's up, then of course Star Wars is going to renegotiate and the price is going to double and the percentage is going to double. It's going to get to a point where Fantasy Flight's going to say, look, it's just not sustainable. It's just not worth it. They don't own the IP. So part of me feels like, look, if you don't own the IP, the rules maker, do you want to steer clear of that game? Because it is going to go defunct. It is going to go default. It is going to be taken away, canceled, changed, and done. Do you get involved? Now, one could say, look, you're investing in a physical project, miniatures, painting, collecting. There are a lot of wargaming systems out there relegated to the dustbins that you could still play. Nothing's stopping that, right? In rebooting a community or playing. And there is that window, if we go back to X-Wing Miniatures, where it was an amazing, amazing ride. Just not only playing tournaments, but getting together at the club, especially when they first released the Epic ships, to get the Corvette, to get the baby Star Destroyer on the table, where we would all bring our miniatures to play, 30, 40 of us, and you'd have hundreds and hundreds of ships on the table playing, coordinated by players. There were some gaming moments that were truly, truly epic. So that ride from the initial launch of X-Wing Miniatures 1.0 to the zenith, to the height, and then to the crash for 2.0, which was just an inevitable delay of the cancellation, that was an amazing ride. And, well, rule number one of miniature wargaming, you never admit how much it cost. Just you absolutely don't admit that publicly. But it was absolutely, in my opinion, worth the time and effort and fun that it brought. Now, I made the decision, and I'm not saying a judgment right or wrong on this. There's multiple factors, and we explored that in kind of wargaming mailbag that I pushed up to the channel here. When a system goes defunct, do you get out and sell your stuff? Do you keep it? Where does it go? What does it do? How do you process that? For 1.0, I had multiples of everything. So my plan wasn't to sell it, was to continue playing it. So every couple of months, we play a game, we bring it out, we roll some dice, we have some fun. We've got more than enough gaming stuff to play, especially once we incorporate some of the terrain and space stations and home rule stuff now that we're completely detached from the tournament system. We don't have to worry about that balance anymore. We can just kind of experiment. So it's not like when a system dies, the power goes off and you can't play it. Things just become very different. Now, some of those systems, of course, X-Wing Miniatures had a tremendous cash inflow, life cycle, lasted a long time. Other systems really, really don't last that long for an IP property. That's the big question. Do you jump in? Do you invest? Do you play in that, knowing that if the company doesn't own the IP, this is going to be very, very, very short-lived? But I could argue and give you an example if it goes the other way. I'm going to give you two final examples before I turn it over to my fellow wargaming enthusiasts. What's that criteria when you're looking to jump into a new war game? And if the company owns the IP, does that have more weight in terms of longevity as opposed to I'm buying the license, I'm making the rules, but you own it? So two examples, Pacific Rim Extinction. I love Pacific Rim, right? Fantastic. And Pacific Rim Extinction is a miniatures game with a true scale, epic scale, heroic scale, whatever we're going to call it, slightly bigger than average miniatures. And you have the Jägermechs for fighting the kaiju. Rule set's pretty solid. There's a couple of moves that are a little bit broken or annoying to counter, but a solid wargaming rule set and some different upgrades and things you can do. And it scales very well. So if you want to do 1-on-1, 2-on-2, 3 or 4, it's got destructible buildings. It's got rules to throw stuff. It's pretty solid. But I knew instantly when this was going to be released that it was going to come out in 4 waves. We'd be lucky if we got to wave 2, because the time frame of release compared to the IP and the licensing, it just didn't have enough steam with that fan base to compete. But I knowingly went in. I was like, I'm in, because I really like the game. I really like the IP. I love the movies from that perspective and the narrative. So that was an easy decision. But I knew going in that this thing was not going to last. An example on the opposite side that doesn't always work out. And this was something that I considered, and I probably honestly would have done if things were a little bit different. But I had to fix my 20-year-old car and just keep it going for another 6 months. So I had to just kind of pump some more money into that. But do you remember Fantasy Flight Games' Rune Wars? Now, this is set in the Terranoth universe. I'm kind of familiar with it because I love Runebound. We kind of do the Rune Age thing, did the battle lore, got that going on. So I understood that it was Fantasy Flight's miniature game system set in a fantasy. So kind of like Warhammer Fantasy rebooted from that. The question there was, I didn't jump into it initially. Rules were solid for what they were. I knew there were going to be a number of units put out. I thought they looked pretty good. Perspective design of miniatures, that's subject to opinion on there, but it looked solid. But it just didn't, in my opinion, have enough traction for the target audience. Fantasy Flight being board games, being X-Wing miniatures, putting out board game type war games like Battle Lore back in the day, to have a true miniature game system where I buy the miniatures, I've got to paint them, I've got to base them, I've got to make the terrain, then I battle. That's not their target audience. Their target audience is board gamers and more kind of like X-Wing miniatures, pre-painted type stuff. So their target base that loves Fantasy Flight and Terranoth, in my opinion, was looking and saying, okay, the rules look pretty solid, but I got to paint this stuff? And how the heck do I do that? I mean, that's a side of the hobby that I think a lot of us that have been wargaming for some time and who have cultivated some sort of painting skill, right? There's various different levels. Some sort of painting skill, that first time is really, really scary to jump into, where you've spent money for your miniatures, you're ready to go, you're enthusiastic, and you're like, but if I paint these things and mess them up, or what if I don't like the colors? Or what if I can't do it? And this is even with the assistance of YouTube and other things. Do you remember back in the day, the how to paint GW? That used to infuriate me, because here I am looking at painting Ultramarines, and it's like Ultramarines in 8 easy steps. So you're like, all right, step 1, just everything blue. Step 2, this. Step 3, the jump from like step 5 to 6 or 6 to 7, you're like, they left out like 10 steps right there. Like something's going on. My miniature does not look like 5 to 6. It was very, very frustrating. And of course, that was back in the dark ages when that's all you had. But even with all the resources today, that's a big jump. A lot of my board gaming friends, when I bring out Zombicide Black Plague, when I bring out Conan, when I bring out some of my board games that have been painted, I never jumped into Massive Darkness. I was close. But when I bring out my board games that are painted, they're tabletop quality, right? They're tabletop quality because these things hit the table, the miniatures fall, the dog ate one, someone stepped on one by accident, Cheeto Fingers just destroyed another. Like, my games are meant to be played. So they're tabletop quality. When I bring those out, a lot of my board gaming friends are like, yo, this is awesome. I would love to paint my miniatures, but like, that's just a whole nother hobby that I'm not ready to jump into. So going back to the Rune Wars and stuff, you've got to paint them. If somehow Fantasy Flight was able to provide those painted, kind of like what was the Dungeons and Dragons dragon game? I almost jumped into that because I love dragons. I love Dungeons and Dragons. I love dungeons. I love dragons. It used the WizKids. It used the X-Wing miniature flight path system, dragon something. I almost jumped in with that. The problem was you just couldn't get enough of the X packs and other units. And when you could, they were just like, I mean, yeah, okay, it's WizKids prices, but they were like $25. They were a lot. And I just wasn't ready to jump in. But back to Fantasy Flight, if they had painted them, I think that would have been different. So that's an example of they own the IP. It never really took off. I think it lasted, 2 years? It didn't even really have regional support. It just couldn't gain steam. Now, there might have been some other factors in there, but then it reached an interesting point. And then I'll turn it over to my fellow wargaming enthusiasts. Almost overnight, there was a ton of stock. And Fantasy Flight was basically like, we're pulling the plug. We're getting out, right? A lot of us have already bailed out with the parachutes already. We're liquidating everything. And basically all of the units for all the factions, they were like $5 to $8 a box. It was just crazy. So at that point, I was like, fix my car or buy up everything. I mean, I could get all of the armies everything up to date. And whether I use them for Dungeons and Dragons, whether I used them for like Kings of War or just some other system, or just played the system as it is, right? Have the whole system, make up some terrain, and now have a kind of a new fun wargaming system to pull out. I was close to doing that. I really was. And if the timing was different, I think I would have, because the deals were just absolutely crazy. Some of the army factions, my buddies were buying up for like Tyranid bits to kit bash and do stuff. It was really, really interesting. But that's an example of, I'm saying, don't ever jump into a war game that the rule set doesn't own the IP. And here's a perfect example of an in-house IP that was cultivated, Terranoth, and grown, Descent and all this type of stuff. But it just never took up that traction. So possibly if you jumped into that, that might have been a disappointment. So the big question, right? Anything to justify more miniatures, more wargaming systems. What is that determining factor? In addition to rules, in addition to established community, in addition to liking the miniatures, because you do have to kind of like the visuals. Does it depend? Does it make a difference? Does it matter if a company owns the IP or if they're leasing the IP?